It's a story many can relate to, a moment in life where you finally decide to stand up for yourself, to take control of your own narrative, only to discover that the consequences of your actions are far more complicated than you ever imagined. For so long, she had been silenced, overlooked, and dismissed. Society had trained her to keep her head down, to not rock the boat, to simply accept the things that came her way, even when they were unfair. But today, something was different. Today, she was done. Done with being the quiet one. Done with letting the world tell her what she could and couldn't do. And she was about to find out just how much power she truly had. She had always been the type to let things slide: disrespect, underestimation, and even blatant injustice. It wasn't that she didn't care, but that she had learned, over time, that it was easier to let things go than to stir the pot. Maybe it was the fear of what might happen if she spoke up, the worry of being labeled difficult, angry, or too much. Maybe it was the weight of history, the feeling that being a black woman meant you always had to be twice as good, twice as patient, and twice as forgiving just to be seen as equal. But something in her had shifted. Maybe it was the long, simmering anger from all those years of suppression. Or maybe it was the moment she saw someone like her, treated unfairly in a way that mirrored her own struggles. Whatever it was, it awakened something in her. Something fierce, unstoppable. Something that told her it was time to stand tall and demand what she was owed. As she walked into the room that morning, she could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her shoulders. She knew what was at stake. She had seen others like her pay the price for speaking up, for not staying in their lane. But what she didn't know was that this moment would unfold in ways she could never have predicted. The room was tense. She could feel the eyes on her, the whispers, the judgment in the air. It was clear that the moment she opened her mouth, everything would change. The people in the room didn't know what she was capable of, didn't know the fire that had been building within her for years. They expected her to stay quiet, to nod along, to play the part they'd assigned her. But she wasn't going to play anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone decide who she was, or how much space she could take up. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The first words she spoke were calm, measured, but they carried the weight of everything she had held inside for so long. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a simple assertion of her opinion, just another voice in a sea of voices. But as the conversation went on, her words started to pierce through the noise. She could see the surprise in their faces, the unease in their eyes. They weren't used to hearing this from her. They weren't used to anyone challenging the status quo, least of all someone like her. It didn't take long for the tension to rise. The others tried to dismiss her, to talk over her, to brush her off as if she didn't matter. But she wasn't having it. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. The things they had said to her in the past, the things they had assumed about her, she wouldn't let them go unchallenged anymore. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore, she was speaking for every woman, every person, who had ever been told to keep quiet, to not take up too much space. And as she spoke, something unexpected happened, something no one could have predicted. But just as she thought she was gaining control, just as she thought she had the upper hand, the world around her shifted. The room, which had once felt so small and suffocating, suddenly seemed much larger, the stakes much higher. The reactions she had expected were nothing compared to what actually happened. The twist that unfolded before her was nothing short of shocking. Was she ready for it? Could she handle what was coming next? And what would it mean for her future, for the future of every person who had ever felt the weight of the world on their shoulders? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, as the room grew colder, more uncertain. What she didn't know was that standing up for herself had unleashed something far beyond her control. The next few moments would be crucial. Everything she thought she knew was about to change. The silence that followed her words was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that happens when everyone is in agreement, or when a conversation has simply reached its natural end. No, the silence was heavy. It was thick with tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath, unsure of what would happen next. The people around her, the ones who had once overlooked her or dismissed her as insignificant, were now looking at her with a mix of confusion, curiosity, and something else, something darker, more uncertain. It was the feeling of a change, something monumental about to happen, but no one knew just how it would unfold. She had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't rock the boat. Growing up, she had learned early on that to be heard meant risking something, maybe not just her reputation, but the very thing that made her feel safe, the very thing that kept her in the shadows, out of harm's way. The expectation placed on her, and others like her, had always been clear: be seen, but not too much. Be heard, but only when necessary. It was a lesson taught by society, by family, by the world around her. It wasn't that anyone had overtly told her to keep quiet, but it was in the unspoken rules that she had learned to follow. She had never questioned them, until now. The decision to speak up had not come easily. It had been a long time coming, a slow burn that had started years ago, when she was just a girl watching other people make decisions for her. Watching her worth be measured by standards she had never agreed to. Watching her talents, her abilities, her desires, pushed aside or minimized because they didn't fit the mold that society had set for her. The first time she tried to speak out, she was told to stay quiet. The second time, she was met with laughter. And each time after that, she grew quieter, smaller, more invisible, until one day she realized she had become everything she had been taught to be: a shadow. But that day, as she stood in the room facing those who had underestimated her, something had shifted. It wasn't just about being right or wrong. It wasn't about proving a point to them. It was about reclaiming the space that had always been hers. It was about taking back what had been stolen from her over the years: the power to speak, the power to act, the power to choose. She had spent far too long being the background player, watching the world pass her by while others wrote her story. Now, it was her turn to write her own. But she had underestimated the resistance that would come. It wasn't just the people in that room who were taken aback by her words, it was the system she had grown up in, the very fabric of the world that had taught her to remain silent. The way people had always behaved around her, the way they had responded to her presence, she was now challenging all of it. The resistance wasn't just from those in front of her, it was from a much deeper, more ingrained force that had existed long before she ever entered that room. She felt the weight of it. They couldn't hide it. She could see it in their eyes, feel it in the way they shifted in their seats, in the way they looked at each other, as if searching for a way out of the conversation. There was fear, yes, but also something else, something more calculated. A kind of hesitation, like they were unsure how to handle her newfound confidence, unsure of what to do with someone who no longer fit the mold they had created for her. In that moment, she realized that standing up for herself wasn't just a personal choice, it was an act of defiance. And defiance, as she would soon learn, could have consequences far beyond her control. The conflict was already brewing. What had started as a simple act of speaking up was beginning to escalate, turning into something far more complex. What was she really fighting for? Was it the respect she deserved? Was it the recognition of her worth? Or was it something deeper, something more primal, a need to reclaim her own power in a world that had spent so long trying to strip it away from her? It didn't take long for the pushback to come. At first, it was subtle, a change in tone, a glance exchanged between those seated around the table. But then, as her words grew sharper, more focused, the resistance became more direct. They tried to invalidate her points, to undermine her confidence, to frame her as unreasonable. They laughed her off, dismissed her as too emotional, or as overreacting, as if her feelings were a threat to their established order. But she was done with being labeled, with being categorized into convenient boxes. She wasn't just an emotion to be dismissed, or a problem to be solved. She was a person, and her voice mattered. And yet, with each attempt to silence her, a deeper uncertainty gnawed at her. Was she really ready for this? Did she understand the full scope of what was at stake? Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced them to stay still. It was all part of the plan now. She couldn't back down. Not when she had already crossed the line. There was no turning back. But even as she thought this, a deep fear began to rise, fear of what would happen if the tables were turned, fear of what she might lose in the process. The meeting dragged on, the tension in the air palpable. She could feel every eye on her, every word they tried to throw at her, every attempt to belittle her, and still, she stood her ground. It was exhausting, and at times, it felt as if the walls were closing in. But then something unexpected happened. The tension didn't just remain in the room, it spread. Word of her actions began to circulate, and it wasn't long before others took notice. People who hadn't been there, people who hadn't heard her speak, now began to weigh in, offering their opinions, their judgments, their thoughts. Some supported her, and some didn't. But the thing that no one expected, the thing that nobody saw coming, was the ripple effect. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had sparked something. People began to talk about it, not just in the context of her personal struggle, but in the context of a larger conversation that had been brewing for years. The very idea of a black woman demanding to be heard was, for some, a concept too radical to accept, and for others, a message that was long overdue. The conversation was spreading, and with it, a new energy began to rise. But with that energy came a price. The higher she climbed, the more dangerous fall would be. She didn't know it yet, but the consequences of her actions were unfolding in ways she could never have imagined. The twist, the one no one could predict, was coming, and it was bigger than anything she could have prepared for. The people who once looked at her with disdain now saw her as a threat. The ones who once dismissed her now saw her as someone to be dealt with, someone who had to be put in her place. What she had awakened in them wasn't just fear, it was a determination to stop what they couldn't control. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't just challenging a room of people. She was challenging a system, a mindset, an entire culture. And as that realization began to dawn on her, so did the weight of what was coming next. She hadn't just stood up for herself, she had changed the game. And in doing so, she had opened the door to a world of possibilities, but also to a world of danger. And now, the question wasn't whether she was ready to face the consequences. The question was whether she could survive them. The days after that meeting felt like a blur. The shock of speaking up had worn off, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty, a feeling that something was slipping through her fingers, something bigger than she could control. She had been expecting resistance from the people in the room, but she hadn't expected ripple effect to be so immediate, so wide-reaching. Everywhere she went, people were talking about her, talking about what she'd said, what it meant. Some were praising her courage, others calling her reckless, and still, others were indifferent, seeing it as just another fleeting moment that would fade away. But she knew it was different. This was no ordinary conversation. She had touched a nerve, and now, things were starting to unravel. At first, the backlash came from places she expected. A few of the senior colleagues, those who had always held the power in the office, began to look at her differently. There were the subtle things, whispers when she passed by, the narrowing of eyes when she spoke in meetings, the coldness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be called harassment. It was the small things that added up, the little ways in which they tried to remind her that they still held the keys to the kingdom, that she was still the one who didn't quite belong. But it wasn't just in the office where the tension was building. As the conversations surrounding her grew louder, they began to spread outside the walls of the building, into the community, into the world beyond. She was being talked about online, her words shared and dissected by strangers. Some people saw her as a hero, a symbol of empowerment, while others saw her as a threat to the established order, someone who needed to be silenced, put in her place. It was the kind of attention that came with consequences, both good and bad. One morning, as she sat in a coffee shop, trying to gather her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a friend, someone who had been in the room that day, someone who had witnessed her stand up for herself. The message was simple: I think you need to be careful. People are talking. They're saying things about you, and it's not good. Stay alert. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time someone had warned her, but the urgency in their words was different this time. Something was changing, and it was happening faster than she could process. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the message. What was happening? What was she missing? She had known the consequences of speaking up wouldn't be easy, but this felt different. It felt personal. The walls, once a safe haven, now felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with every passing second. She could feel it in the way people avoided her gaze, in the way conversations stopped when she entered the room, in ways she was being treated like an outsider in her own life. The worst part was that she couldn't figure out who the enemy was. Who was behind this sudden wave of hostility? Was it just the people who had always underestimated her, the ones who had dismissed her before? Or was there something bigger at play, something more dangerous lurking in the shadows? One evening, she stayed late at the office, her mind unable to focus on anything but the mounting pressure. The building was nearly empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the otherwise quiet halls. As she packed her things to leave, she saw someone standing near the entrance, their back turned. It was a colleague she had never gotten to know well, someone who had been in the meeting that day but hadn't spoken much. Her stomach twisted in knots as she approached them. Something about the way they stood there felt off, like they were waiting for her. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure turned slowly, and she was met with a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down her spine. It was as if this person had been waiting for the right moment to speak, to give her a warning, or worse, a threat. "You're making waves," they said, their voice low and sharp. "You need to understand that some people don't take kindly to that. You've stirred things up, and now they're looking at you. You're not the hero you think you are. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always known that speaking up would come with risks, but she hadn't anticipated the danger to feel so real. The feeling of being watched, of being controlled, of being part of something she didn't fully understand, it was overwhelming. She took a step back, trying to steady herself, but the weight of it all was too much. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway, leaving her standing there, her thoughts racing. Who had they meant? Who was the they were talking about? What game was she unwittingly part of? Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. She wasn't just up against a few colleagues who didn't like what she had said. This was bigger. There were forces at play here, people with power, with influence, who were watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake. She had become part of something much larger than she could have imagined. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. She kept her head down, tried to blend in, but the sense of being watched never left her. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a reminder that she was no longer in control. People spoke to her differently now, with caution, with distance. It wasn't just the usual office politics anymore, it was something darker, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But as the tension mounted, so did her resolve. She had come this far, she couldn't back down now. She had a choice to make: stay quiet and let the fear consume her, or keep pushing forward, regardless of the consequences. The decision wasn't easy, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to be silenced again. Not by them, not by anyone. But even as she made her decision, a deeper question lingered in the back of her mind. What was the cost of standing up for yourself? And more importantly, was she willing to pay it? The days that followed felt like a never-ending game of cat and mouse. She had made her choice, but the weight of that decision was starting to press down on her in ways she hadn't fully expected. Every conversation seemed to be laced with something hidden, every glance held meaning, and every moment of silence felt suffocating. It was as if the walls around her were closing in, tightening with each passing hour. She could no longer tell where the pressure was coming from. Was it from her own fear, or from the people who were now watching her every move? At first, it had been just the subtle things, the way people whispered when she entered a room, the slight shift in tone when she spoke. But soon, the atmosphere had become more oppressive. The tension that had started in the office began to spill into her personal life, creeping into her relationships, even changing the way she interacted with the people closest to her. Friends began pulling away, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in her, unsure of where they stood in all of this. Those who had once supported her now seemed uncertain, torn between the loyalty they felt toward her and the fear they had of the unseen forces that seemed to be closing in on her. It was as if the entire world had shifted. The more she held her ground, the more isolated she became. The friends who had stood by her before, the colleagues who had once respected her, everyone was now looking at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some whispered that she was too bold, too stubborn. Others said she was brave, but reckless. And in the midst of all of it, she couldn't help but wonder, was she doing the right thing? Or had she crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Her days were filled with an unsettling mix of paranoia and determination. She started second-guessing herself at every turn, wondering if she was imagining the growing hostility, the cold stares, the conversations that seemed to stop the moment she walked in. But then there were the moments when it all became too real to ignore: the hidden messages, the anonymous notes left in her office, the strange phone calls that came in the middle of the night. It was the kind of attention that didn't feel like simple office gossip. It felt like something darker, something with a purpose. And then, one evening, the moment came. She had stayed late again, the quiet of the office her only company. It wasn't unusual for her to be the last one left. She preferred the solitude, the silence where she could think. But tonight, as she walked down the empty hall, the feeling of being watched washed over her again. It was different this time. More urgent. More suffocating. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone was lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned the corner, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. She wasn't alone. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, and every instinct in her screamed to turn around, to leave before it was too late. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had already gone through. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't someone she recognized, but the way they stood, still and silent, sent a wave of dread through her. They weren't just waiting for her to approach, they were waiting for her to make a decision. To take the first step toward whatever came next. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. Her mind raced, every possible scenario flashing before her. Was this it? Was this the moment she had been dreading? Or was it something else entirely? She had no way of knowing, but she couldn't turn back now. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't hide. The figure didn't move. It was as if they hadn't even heard her. And then, slowly, they took a step forward, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she stood frozen, unable to move. "Do you think you're untouchable?" the figure asked, their voice low, almost whispering, but it sent a chill through her. There was something in the tone that made her skin crawl, something sinister, something that felt like a warning. Her stomach dropped as the words sank in. "Untouchable?" Was that what they thought of her? Had she really become so bold, so certain in her actions, that she had unknowingly provoked something much bigger than herself? Before she could respond, the figure took another step forward, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She took a step back, instinctively, her mind screaming at her to leave, to get out of there. But her feet didn't move fast enough. She could feel the tension rising, the weight of everything she had been through bearing down on her. The moment she had feared was finally here, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of her fear. "What's happening? Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they took another step closer, and this time, she felt their presence like a physical force, like they were invading her space, her life. The air around her seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment. "You're not the first to think they could change things," the figure said, their words colder now, sharper. "But you are the first to challenge us. And for that, you will pay the price." Her heart stopped. Pay the price? What did that mean? What price? Before she could process the meaning of their words, the figure reached into their jacket and pulled out something small and metallic, holding it out toward her. The gleam of it in the dim light caught her attention, and her stomach twisted. It was a phone, but not just any phone. It was one of the company-issued devices, the kind she had used herself, the kind that was supposed to be for work purposes only. "Think carefully before you do anything else," the figure said, their voice calm now, but the threat was undeniable. "You're not as alone as you think." The figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows before she could react. She was left standing there, her mind racing, her heart still pounding in her chest. What had just happened? What did they mean by all of it? What was she supposed to do now? In that moment, she realized something that both terrified and invigorated her. This wasn't just a personal struggle anymore. It was a war, one that was bigger than she could have ever imagined, one with forces at play that she couldn't even begin to understand. And as much as she wanted to run, to escape from it all, she knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. The game had changed. And she was already in too deep to back out. Her mind was a whirlwind as she stood there, alone in the dark hallway, trying to make sense of the encounter. The words from the figure still echoed in her ears, each one heavier than the last. "You're not as alone as you think." It was a chilling reminder that there was something much larger at play, something she had only just begun to understand. As much as she tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, the sense of unease lingered. She wasn't sure who they were, but she was starting to realize just how deep the web of control went. The price she was about to pay wasn't just for standing up for herself, it was for disrupting something much more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The next morning, as she walked into office, everything seemed off. The air was thick with tension, but it wasn't just the usual coldness. This felt different. People were looking at her as if they knew something she didn't. As if they were waiting for the inevitable to unfold. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the weight of their stares felt heavier today, more deliberate. And then she saw it, an email sitting in her inbox with no subject line, the message body completely blank except for a single line of text at the bottom: "You're being watched." Her pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone, somewhere, was keeping tabs on her every move. It was the confirmation she hadn't wanted, but deep down, she knew it was coming. She was part of something much larger now, something she didn't fully understand, but that seemed determined to make her pay for disturbing status quo. The rest of the day was a blur. She couldn't focus on her work. Every noise, every glance, every strange phone call or hushed conversation sent her mind spiraling further into paranoia. Was she being paranoid, or was this really happening? Was she really in danger, Or had she crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The questions plagued her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, but there was no easy answer. Every path she tried to follow seemed to lead to another dead end, and the further she dug, the deeper the hole seemed to get. As the day wore on, she noticed something else, something that sent a wave of dread through her. Her phone, the one that had been issued by the company, had started to act strangely. Apps were crashing for no reason, messages appeared and disappeared with no trace, and the battery seemed to drain faster than it should. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just a glitch, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. It felt deliberate. Someone, somewhere, had access to her phone, her personal life. She wasn't in control anymore. That evening, she decided to confront the situation head-on. She couldn't keep hiding from it, couldn't keep running. If someone was watching her, if they were trying to manipulate her every move, she needed to find out who it was and why. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but something had shifted in her. She was no longer just reacting to the events around her, she was ready to take action. After a long, exhausting day, she headed home, hoping to get some rest and clear her mind. But as soon as she walked in the door, the feeling of unease washed over her again. Something was wrong. The apartment was too quiet, too still. She glanced around, scanning the room for anything out of place. It wasn't until she reached her bedroom that she saw it, the unmistakable sign that someone had been there. Her heart skipped a beat as she walked toward her dresser. The drawers had been opened, the contents shuffled, as though someone had been looking for something. She hadn't left them like that. She hadn't even been in the room that day. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Someone had been inside her apartment. Someone had been watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the room, searching for any other signs of intrusion. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest, but nothing else seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry, no obvious signs of damage, just a faint sense of disturbance. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the panic started to set in. She wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted. Whoever was behind this knew exactly where she was, knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't until she noticed her phone sitting on the bedside table that the full weight of it hit her. The phone was turned on, but the screen was cracked, and when she picked it up, the battery was completely drained. It was as if someone had been using it, monitoring her every move. And that's when it clicked: the email, the strange phone calls, the glitches, the messages disappearing. It was all connected. Someone had infiltrated her life, had been watching her from the very beginning. But who? Who had the power to do something like this? Who had the resources, the reach, to invade her privacy like this? She thought back to the people she had worked with, the ones who had been watching her, the ones who had been subtly pushing her away. Were they in on this? Or was there someone else behind it all? Someone she hadn't even considered? The feeling of being trapped closed in around her, the walls pressing down until she could barely breathe. She had to do something, had to act fast before whatever was happening to her escalated even further. But with every step she took, it felt like she was walking deeper into a web she couldn't escape. The knock at the door came just as she was about to make a call to a trusted friend. She froze, her blood running cold as she slowly walked toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Who could it be? She hadn't told anyone where she was, and yet here it was, the knock that felt like a signal, a sign that something terrible was about to unfold. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether she should answer or pretend she wasn't home. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling, and as she opened it, her world tilted sideways. Standing in the doorway was someone she had never expected to see, someone from her past, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Their face was unreadable, but there was something in their eyes, something dark, something that told her everything she needed to know. This was no coincidence. This was the beginning of something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The figure standing in the doorway was someone she never thought she'd see again. Their face was familiar, but altered, as though the years had done something to their soul. The expression they wore was a mixture of something unreadable and unsettling, like they knew something she didn't. Her pulse spiked, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She stood there, staring at them, her hand still clutching the door handle, her mind racing to make sense of everything that had led her to this point. "Can I help you?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to make it sound firm, as though she had control over the situation. Inside, she felt anything but in control. This person, this ghost from her past, was the last person she ever expected to show up at her door. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they glanced over their shoulder, as if checking for something, before stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Their presence was overwhelming, and for a moment she felt like the walls of her apartment were closing in on her. There was something strange about this encounter, something that felt off, like she was being pulled into a story she hadn't been prepared for. "You're not safe," they finally said, their voice low and steady, but there was an urgency to it that made her blood run cold. "You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's too late." She took a step back, instinctively trying to put some distance between them. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Why are you here?" The figure's eyes flickered, and then, with a sigh, they removed something from their pocket and held it out to her. It was a small, sleek device, a piece of technology she recognized all too well. It was the same type of phone that had been tampered with, the one that had started malfunctioning after the night she'd confronted the mysterious figure in the office hallway. Her heart sank as she realized what this meant. "I'd been watching you," they said, their tone dark, almost regretful. "Everything you've done, everything you've uncovered. It's not just about you anymore. There's a larger game at play, and you've unknowingly stepped right into it." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This person had been part of it all along. They weren't just a stranger showing up at her door, they were part of the network she had been trying to expose. They were the ones pulling the strings from behind the scenes, the ones who had orchestrated everything. Every glitch, every phone call, every warning, it had all been designed to manipulate her, to push her into a corner where they could finally reveal the truth. Or rather, their version of the truth. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of her realization. The figure's eyes softened for just a moment, and then they stepped closer. "I'm not your enemy," they said, but their words did nothing to ease the fear gnawing at her. "I'm trying to save you." "Save me?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "From what?" They didn't answer right away. Instead, they gestured for her to sit down, and though she hesitated, she finally complied, the tension in her chest unbearable. The room felt colder now, as if the air had thickened with the weight of unspoken truths. "I'm going to tell you everything," they said, their voice low. "But you need to understand something first. What you've uncovered. It's bigger than you think. You've only scratched the surface. And the people behind this? They've been watching you for a lot longer than you realize." She blinked, her mind spinning. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. She had thought she was fighting for something important, something that mattered. But now she understood that the stakes were far higher than she could have ever imagined. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure hesitated. They looked over their shoulder again, as if afraid someone might be listening. "They're everywhere. In the shadows. The ones who control the narrative, who manipulate everything. They own the power, the technology, the information. And now they want you. They want you to join them." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. She tried to process what they were saying, but it felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath her. The world she had known, the people she had trusted, none of it was what it seemed. "But why me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why now?" The figure's eyes softened again, and they took a deep breath before speaking. "Because you're the only one who can stop them." The words hit her like a bombshell. She had no idea what they meant by that. She had never signed up to be some kind of hero. She had just wanted to stand up for herself, for what was right. But now, she was tangled in something much darker than she had ever imagined. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. The figure didn't answer at first. They just stared at her, as if weighing their next words carefully. Then, with a quiet, resigned sigh, they spoke again. "If you refuse," they said softly, "you'll become their target. They'll come for you, and they'll make sure you never have the chance to fight back. They're not afraid to destroy everything in their path. Your life, your future, everything you've worked for, none of it will matter." The weight of their words hung heavily in the room. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She didn't want to get involved in this twisted game. She didn't want to fight against the shadowy force that controlled everything. But what choice did she have? And then, just as the tension reached its peak, something shifted in the room. The door to her apartment creaked open again, and a new figure stepped inside. This one was different, calm, collected, but there was something chilling about them. Their gaze locked onto hers, and for a split second, she felt as though they could see right through her. "You should have listened," the new figure said, their voice smooth, but dripping with a coldness that made her skin crawl. "Now you've involved yourself in something that has no way out." The first figure stepped back, their eyes flashing with uncertainty. "I didn't want this for her. She's not ready for what's coming." But it was too late. The moment the second figure entered the room, everything changed. The truth about who they were, who the first figure truly was, and who she had become in this dangerous game was about to be revealed, though in ways she could never have anticipated. The tension between the figures in the room was palpable, and it was clear the game had just taken a much darker turn. The air in the apartment was thick with tension as the second figure stepped deeper into the room. Their presence, cold and calculated, seemed to drain all the warmth from the space. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and her pulse quickened. What was happening? Who were these people, and what did they want with her? The first figure, the one who had been trying to help, took a step back, as if surrendering the space. "I tried to warn you," they said, their voice laced with regret. "But I couldn't stop it. I'm not the one they want. You are." The second figure's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach their eyes. "You were always too soft. You could never understand what had to be done." The words struck like a blow, and she felt her stomach tighten in fear. The realization hit her in waves. This wasn't just about her standing up for herself anymore. This wasn't even just about what she had uncovered, it was about control, power, and manipulation on a scale she had never imagined. "You've been watching me all along, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. It was a question, but there was no need for an answer. She already knew. The strange occurrences, the glitches, the strange phone calls, it all led here. To this moment, to these two figures who had controlled everything from the shadows. The second figure nodded slowly. "We knew exactly who you were from the start. We knew how you would react. You thought you were fighting for justice, for truth. But you were just a pawn in a much bigger game." Her mind reeled as their words sank in. A pawn? She had always seen herself as more than that, as someone capable of making a real difference. But now, standing there with these two figures, she realized just how small she had been in the grand scheme of things. The truth was ugly, and she was just one piece in a puzzle much larger than she had ever realized. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you want from me? The second figure's smile widened, but it was cold. You have two choices. You can join us and continue to play your part in the game. Or you can refuse and become a threat, a liability. And if you become a liability, we'll make sure you disappear. Like everyone else who's tried to stop us. Her heart raced as the words hung in the air, thick with the weight of her decision. Join them? Be part of this twisted game? Or walk away and risk losing everything? She had spent her whole life standing up for what was right, fighting for justice, but now she was faced with an impossible choice. She glanced at the first figure, the one who had tried to help. Their face was filled with sorrow, but they didn't speak. They had given her the choice. Now, it was up to her. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. She knew that whatever decision she made, it would change everything. There was no turning back. The world she thought she understood had been shattered, and she was left to pick up the pieces. But she couldn't be a pawn anymore. She couldn't let them control her, manipulate her. I won't join you, she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. I won't be part of your game. The second figure's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was silence. It was the kind of silence that made her question whether she had made the right choice. Was it too late? Had she sealed her own fate by refusing them? But then, unexpectedly, the first figure stepped forward. I warned you that this wouldn't be easy, they said softly, their tone regretful but resigned. But I'm with you. I'll help you fight. The second figure's face twisted in anger. You think you can stop us? They scoffed, their voice dripping with disdain. You think you have the power to change anything? The first figure met their gaze, unwavering. Maybe not everything. But I can help her see the truth. And if she fights, we fight. Together. A tense silence followed, and for a moment, it seemed like the world itself held its breath. The second figure's expression faltered, but only for a second. Their smile returned, colder than before. You're making a mistake, they said, turning to leave. But you'll learn. We'll make sure of it. And with that, they were gone. She stood there, her heart still pounding, her thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. The room felt suddenly quieter, almost empty, as though the presence of the second figure had drained all the life from it. But in that silence, something changed. Something inside her. She had made the decision, and though it wasn't easy, she knew it was the right one. She wouldn't be controlled. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. The first figure remained, watching her with a look of quiet understanding. You did the right thing, they said, their voice barely a whisper. But now we have to move quickly. They'll be watching. They won't stop. She nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settling within her. It wasn't over yet. The battle had only just begun. The next few weeks were a blur. The first figure, who had become her ally, helped her uncover the truth behind the network that had been controlling everything from the shadows. Slowly but surely, they gathered information, pieced together the puzzle. And with each new revelation, the picture grew clearer. They weren't just manipulating her, they were controlling entire industries, entire governments. They were the ones pulling the strings behind every major decision, every shift in the global balance of power. But despite the weight of the truth, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been controlled. The battle wasn't just hers, it was theirs too. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like it was met with 2 steps back. There were moments of doubt, moments when the pressure seemed too much to bear. But through it all, she remained steadfast, knowing that this was her fight. This was the chance to take back control, to rewrite the story that had been written for her. And in the end, after countless obstacles, after everything had been laid bare, they succeeded. The network that had been controlling everything from the shadows was dismantled. The truth was exposed, and with it, a new sense of freedom. But even as the dust settled, and the weight of the victory began to sink in, she knew that the fight would never truly be over. The shadows would always exist. There would always be those who tried to control, to manipulate. But now, she knew how to fight back. And she would. For herself. For everyone. The last thing she thought as she stood on the balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, was that she had learned something invaluable. Sometimes, the greatest power isn't in what you can see, it's in what you choose to believe. And in that belief, there was nothing she couldn't overcome.